Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in our series Abolition. Quite timely, as it happens. We wanted to look at the demand to abolish the army tonight. Obviously, with what's happened in Ukraine, we thought it very timely, or well, let's put it like that. It would be very stupid not to mention the situation in Ukraine if you're discussing an issue like this. So we're very pleased to have with us Jack Conrad, Communist Party of Great Britain, who's written on this question many times. And we basically, I think we need to be clear that we don't take sides in this conflict, two pro-imperialist sides fighting each other. But a lot of people seem to have felt the need, a lot of people on the left seem to have felt the need to have, take sides, who is the baddie, who's the good guy, which is probably natural, or we're told by so many different people that that's what you have to do. The problem then arises that things can get quite confusing, as last night, a lot of people thought, what's NATO and NATO expansion, which I think is correct. But then, Putin goes and does something like that. Does that then make him the baddie or the goodie? Or, I think that's both these things are, wrong. We don't need to take sides in this conflict or any other inter-imperialist conflict. So we wanted to look at this question. I think the demand for abolition of the army is very much part of this understanding that as socialists, we do not back either side in an imperialist war. And we also want to look at questions like the main enemy is at home. Is that still relevant when somebody like Putin seems to be the main aggressor at the moment? Can we still say the main enemy is our own ruling class? And what does that mean concretely? Enough from me. Jack Conrad will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions and comments from the floor. Hi, Jack.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I haven't prepared any notes simply because of the situation that's unfolding before our eyes, and I think I'm sort of obliged at least to say something on that. The first point I would actually say, although I'm not going to get on my high horse and say that Russia isn't imperialist, I don't think it's. I don't think it fits into the classic definition, other than if you were talking about Imperial Russia under the Tsars, or Imperial Rome, or Imperial China. Clearly, it's a big power. Clearly, it's a bully, and will have defensive, offensive designs on its neighbors. Nonetheless, this isn't the same as World War I. Nonetheless, I do think that you can draw an analogy. I know all analogies break down, but I mean, at least as a guide, they can serve a certain purposes. I think there is, something similar to what's going on now to World War I. Therefore, I think it would be profoundly mistaken to start talking about Ukraine in isolation from big power politics, i.e. the United States and its allies, Russia, China, and the struggle for global hegemony. That to me, it is what's going on. The United States is a declining power, and it's pushing back in the main against China, and Russia is part of that big game. So while we undoubtedly are right to feel huge sympathy for the Ukrainian people, who are being invaded, bombed as we speak, I think it's important not to fall into the, camp of saying, well, Russia started it, defend Ukraine, because to all intents and purposes, if you do that, you're lining up with NATO and the United States. In the same way, in World War I, while we would feel sympathy for the people of Belgium as the German army overrun that neutral country in order to strike deep into France. Nonetheless, if you sided with poor little Belgium, what you were doing is lining up with not only Anglo-French imperialism, but what you were doing is lining up with its ally, Russian imperialism. And if we look at the sort of classic, at least Leninist approach at the time, remember that was a minority view amongst socialists, very much a minority view amongst socialists. Lenin distinguished himself by saying that, yes, the main enemy is at home. The main enemy for people in Britain is in London, not in Berlin, not in Vienna, and the same applied in Russia. And therefore, the slogan of turn imperialist war into civil war, turn what is an imperialist war into a struggle to overthrow the ruling class and establish socialism. And that really brings me to the subject that's been advertised today. And that is you can't even call it a socialist slogan. It is a socialist slogan, abolish the standing army, but it goes way back, long before socialism, communism, Marxism. It's a sort of program of radicals. It's certainly the program of Democrats, and in the mythology, at least, of the radical bourgeoisie. This is something that goes back to ancient Rome, the militia of the Roman Republic. Now, I'm not going to go on about the Roman Republic, but I'll simply mention that if you look at the writings of that notorious individual, I think he's got a undeserved bad reputation. That's Machiavelli. If you look at his military writings, what's notable about them is his call to get rid of the standing army, the professional army, the mercenary army, and to go over to a citizen militia. And he was an actual participant in changing his home city from having a professional mercenary army who proved pretty bloody useless in military affairs, going over to a civilian militia. And that idea was taken up by people in Britain, certainly in England, was taken over the Atlantic to the United States, hence the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, the right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia, and the demand that the forming of a standing army can only be done with the consent of Congress. In other words, that would be an emergency measure. Why would that be? Basically because radicals, Democrats, socialists like ourselves do not trust professional armies, mercenary armies that do it for the pay. We don't trust small armies that are armed when the mass of the population are unarmed. It leads to oppression. It prevents us from actually changing a government. Okay, so this was a demand, as I say, that predates Marxism, predates modern socialism, but it became a standard demand amongst socialists. So if you look at the Communist Manifesto of 1848, if you look at the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which was the demands of Marx and Engels when they returned home during the time of the German Revolution, there's the demand for the arming of the people, the abolition of the standing army. And you'll find that in the program of Goethe, unification between the Eisenachers and the Lassallians in 1875, and you'll find it throughout, the period of classical social democracy. So in the French Workers' Party, in the Italian Socialist Party, in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. I don't think there's an exception, actually, in terms of the parties that were affiliated to the Second International. You wouldn't find that in their programme. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. And that even includes the Labour Party. So the Labour Party, in its first manifesto, actually included abolition of the standing army, replacement by a people's militia. Now, there are those on the left that counterpose, the idea of a workers' militia, because that sounds much more radical, to a people's militia. But I think it's just worthwhile pointing out that in the middle of 1917, when you actually did have a workers' militia, the Red Guard in Russia, that Lenin viewed this very much as a prelude to the abolition of the standing army, which had more or less been accomplished in the middle of 1917, and the police. And I know that you've got a session on the police later, but the replacement of those institutions by the armed people. So the workers' militia, the Red Guard, was seen as a prelude, a step in that direction. It's also worthwhile pointing out that although the Bolsheviks actually had to abandon their program when it came to a popular militia and go, under Trotsky's brilliant leadership, to a full-time Red Army, in order not only to beat the whites, but to fend off the invading Poles, the invading Japanese. Was it 13 armies of intervention, including Britain and the United States? They had to go for a peasant army staffed by former Tsarist officers, but under the political direction of commissars. So under the political direction of the Communist Party, you had this peculiar hybrid army. And what I wanted to just to point out is that at the end of the Civil War, as Commissar of War, Trotsky actually proposed to the Central Committee, well, surely now's the time, now that we've won, now's the time for us actually to close down the Red Army and to go back to our program and a popular militia. Well, I wasn't there at the time. Maybe the others thought that given the constant rumors and constant threats of invasion, not only from Poland, but the big imperial powers, most notably Britain and France, that wouldn't be advisable. Either way, the point I'm really trying to make is that the people's militia was common sense amongst socialists all the way through the second half of the 19th century, all the way into the 20th century. And it had a prehistory that goes way back to Renaissance Italy and revolutionary America and all the rest of it. Okay, so what do we think the advantages of a popular militia are? Well, first of all, a popular militia relies on the armed people, and the socialist project, the Marxist project, certainly relies on winning a majority. It's not a minoritarian coup. It is something that we have to have the majority of people on our side. And it's in that context that we think that we can actually turn a popular militia from being an institution that simply upholds law and order into an institution that actually upholds our right to make revolution. And the basic thesis is that a popular militia is the best sort of armed institution where rank and file soldiers who identify with the project of socialism, with the what the masses of people want and what the masses of people are striving towards, they are most likely to disobey the orders of officers if they decide to side with what Marx and Engels, almost habitually called the slave owners' rebellion, obviously taking their cue from the American Civil War, the American Second Revolution, but they expected such a rebellion in countries like Britain, in countries such as Germany, in countries such as France, that the ruling class ain't likely to simply roll over and say, well, you got a majority in popular elections, or you command a popular majority, we're going to abide by that. No, the chances are that they won't abide by it. The best guarantee, of course, that they do abide by it is a popular militia that is loyal to a new government or a putative government, or a popular militia, as I said, where the rank and file simply turn round to officers that are wanting them to shoot down their brothers and sisters and turn around and say, no, we're not going to obey those orders. And indeed, the officers under those circumstances need to know that their own lives are at risk. So if we look, I suppose, at the most famous document in that respect, it would be Engels's pamphlet that was issued towards the end of his life, Can Europe Disarm? And what he was talking about in terms of disarmament was the great battleships, were the great standing armies that Europe was accumulating. Both Engels and Marx feared a World War I. They thought that tens of millions of people were going to die, and they thought that the socialist project would be thrown back as a result of that. So Engels comes along with a propagandist pamphlet that says, well, what we can do is stage by stage replace the standing army of Germany, Russia, France, Britain, all these countries with a popular militia. And what Engels had in mind is, if that happened, well, that's one thing. But the main point would be to actually win the hearts and minds of the masses to that program. Certainly, if you could force through such a program, then what we're seeing in Ukraine would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, i.e. An offensive war. Popular militias are pretty damn useless. I've already tried to illustrate that with the Red Army. It could fight, well, it had to go professional in order to fight across the whole of the old Russian Empire, and certainly proved completely useless when it was simply on a militia system. But anyway, my main point is that what militias are good at is mobilizing very quickly, mobilizing very large numbers of fighters and resisting invasions. They're not very good at going on the offensive and invading other countries. Okay, so I don't know how much longer I've got. What have I got? 21 minutes so far. So I'm going to sort of start to come to a conclusion. I suppose the most famous example of such a system isn't so many miles away from us. That is Switzerland. I'm not exactly sure how many professional soldiers the Swiss army has. It's numbered in the thousands, though. And I think it's under 10,000. And the figure 5,000 sort of comes to my mind. And what they consist of is full-time trainers, teach you how to fire a cannon, teach you how to launch a surface-to-air missile, yes, 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 and certain professional officers, but around about 5,000. Meanwhile, every citizen, and I think it might be male citizen, but I'm not sure of that, but I know that every citizen between the ages, and I'm just going to make this one up, 18 and 55, it could be 60, has to keep a firearm, and we're talking about a automatic or semi-automatic rifle at home, locked up, but ready to be mobilized at extremely short notice. And if you look at Switzerland, of course, we know as a mountainous country, no one would be, how should I put it, wanting to actually engage with such a militia system. But it's also worthwhile pointing out that works exceedingly well. I'm sure you have provision for people who have, religious objections to joining the army, etc., etc., etc. Nonetheless, it's a system that works, and it's a system that we could copy. And therefore, I come to me, the left as it's presently constituted, and I think, well, I find it very strange that when people like myself say, well, we ought to have in our program the idea of a popular militia, we ought to have the idea of abolishing the army, the left run in horror from that demand. People like Robert Griffiths in the Morning Star's Communist Party of Britain basically thinks that this is some sort of MI5 provocation, that if you raise such a demand, there you are, the police will be knocking on your door, the spooks will be spying on you. I know that, people like Dave Nellis, we've asked, what do you think about that idea? He doesn't want to go there. He doesn't want to talk about the question, let alone the Labour Party nowadays, which fully accepts, certainly under Sir Keir, not only a professional army, but membership of NATO and NATO's wars. So I do find that strange. I do find it strange that what used to be common sense for socialists, for radicals going way back into history, is now viewed as something crazy, as dangerous, as something that we should keep our mouths shut about. And my fear is, if we keep our mouths shut about it, then we actually mentally disarm our side. And I'll simply finish with this, that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, I mean, I had hopes that things would be far better in terms of Labour Party changes and, an aggressive approach to the Labour right. But what I was saying to comrades was, well, if those changes came through and Jeremy Corbyn could renew the parliamentary Labour Party and win a thumping majority in the House of Commons, and he could persuade the Queen to invite him to Buckingham Palace, then what you'd see is the pushback, not only from Mike Pompeo and the CIA, but we also knew at the time from British generals, from the high command, from the high ranks of the army. And well, precisely, we've seen examples of what happens to a left that doesn't take the question of a people's militia, doesn't take the question of politicizing the army seriously. And the one that's seared in my mind is, of course, given my age, is the overthrow of the Popular Unity government in Chile under Salvador Allende, by the CIA and by the army led by General Pinochet. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. I'll ask you a couple of questions already, if that's okay with you. Comrades, if you have any questions or want to make comments, please click raise hand and I'll bring you in. And so it's interesting, Labour Party had a standing army as a demand. When was that? Can you repeat the date? It
was 1900, the first manifesto. I was very surprised, but yes, it's there in black and white.
Well, in 1910, I think that abolished the House of Lords in its in its program. But I mean, what do you think about it in the Ukraine now? The Prime Minister has said, everybody go and get guns, and so you can all get guns now and shoot the Russians. I mean, is that something positive in this context that could be, if they keep hold of these weapons and then turn it against, somebody else afterwards? Do you think that's a positive thing potentially?
I'd be very hesitant to answer that. All I would say is that the tragedy that we've got at the present time is that the left is so weak, the working class movement is so weak compared with the past, where Lenin could say, well, we'll organize a revolution, and you could take it seriously, because look at German social democracy, look at Austrian social democracy, look at the mass base that they had in Russia, and one can go on throughout Europe. Now, the left is a marginal force. But all I would say is that, to me, the job of socialists is precisely to raise the sort of perspective that you alluded to, i.e., if you've got guns, not only is the Russian army your enemy, but surely the oligarchs, surely the neoliberal regime in Kiev is also your enemy. So therefore, I wouldn't advocate national defensism simply because the government in Kiev has been subordinated to the West, has aligned itself with the West, is an associate member of NATO and is being armed by NATO. So it's a complex question, but I sort of agree with the drift that you're suggesting, i.e. our job is to actually organize the working class so it's in a position to become the ruling class. If that's your drift, and I think it was, I agree, yeah.
Because when you mention things like, everybody should have a gun and, etc., people will mention, oh, look at America, where you can have guns and people are killing each other, etc. But you'd have to take the crime around drugs into consideration, I think, which most people don't. I mean, that demand, didn't it, in the US, that comes from quite a revolutionary past, not the demand, sort of the right to bear arms. Could you talk about that perhaps a little bit, if you know about it?
Well, I'm not a historian of America, but yeah, my understanding is precisely the amendments to the Constitution, the first and the second one, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, were the result of popular pressure from below. This wasn't the slaveocracy, it wasn't the capitalist class, the merchant class insisting on that. It was the farmers, it was the workers, it was the democracy that were insisting on that. And I just think that, again, I like your question in terms of America, but I've already raised the question of Switzerland. Now, I don't know what the murder rate is in Switzerland, but I wouldn't have thought, but you know what I mean? You say Switzerland, and I know the old joke about Switzerland, the only thing it ever invented was the cuckoo clock and whatever the hell it was, Orson Welles and the Third Man and all that sort of stuff. But it isn't known, is it? Even though every house has a cabinet up there with a excuse me, automatic up there, it's not known for its massive slaughter on the streets. So my argument would be that the high murder rate in the United States is not explained by guns. There are other explanations. It's not guns in themselves. The population can be armed, and if it's living in harmony, one with the other, if there's a sense of social solidarity, people don't tend to go around murdering each other. So yeah.
Thank you. George would like to come in. I know you don't have a camera, so I'm going to just allow you to talk now.
Thank you. And Thanks for that initial tour of Ukraine, the conflict, which is just starting. My feeling is that it's degenerate capitalism engaging in a circumvent of Russia. And also it's partially about resources, pipelines, and so on. It was also inflamed when Crimea ceded to Russia, and Crimea ceded to Russia voluntarily. The people of Crimea, which includes a large contingent of Tatars, actually voluntarily ceded to Russia. Russia did not annex it. And it is my view that our job as socialists is to pinpoint who the actors are in Ukraine. A large number of the actors are revanchist fascists. They are people of the old Bandera crowd who in World War II assisted Nazi Germany in the repression of a number of different peoples in Europe, and also fought alongside Germany in Ukraine against what was then the Soviet army. And the Soviet army paid with many, many casualties. Ukraine was one of the worst battle scenes in the last World War. Moving on to militias, we have had in Britain some modern equivalents to people's militias. One of which was, for instance, the early Notting Hill riots. Now, this militia was defensive, essentially, against what they saw as police oppression. The local people ganged up and protected not only themselves, but black businesses in Notting Hill. Another example, a modern example, of course, is the Panthers in the US. They rioted in defense of black interests and black people. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad. Do you want to respond to any of this, Jack? You can wait for a few more questions.
Well, I'll just come very quickly, George. I mean, just in terms of which side is evil, if you want. I personally, I don't have any particular problem in saying that there's a problem on both sides. I mean, I don't see anything pretty or progressive about the Putin regime. So, okay, we all know that the dominant power is the United States. It's pushing back against its decline. It might win, I don't know. But that's what's going on. And Russia, in that sense, is carrying out an aggressive defensive war in the same way as Kaiser Germany did in 1914. So, yes, you're right that in World War II, there were fascists. There still are fascists in Ukraine, but let's not dress it up as a rerun of the Red Army under Stalin with Hitler Germany. I don't think it is. And for all Putin talking about genocide, I think that's got as much reality to it in Ukraine as the genocide of the Uyghurs in China. That doesn't mean there's no oppression in China. That doesn't mean there's no oppression in Ukraine of Russians. But to me, my general approach is a pox on both sides.
Thank you. Ken, please.
Good evening, Jack. Thank you very much for that talk. In terms of citizen militias versus professional armies, how far is there a pattern of societies in their early years, I'm speaking in terms of centuries here, having what in effect is a citizen militia, and then at some point in their history, feeling a need to develop a professional army? You said earlier, and I think correctly, that citizen militias are good for defense against an invasion. They are not good for attacking somebody else, which to me sounds like a strong argument in their favor. But I mean, how far is the transition from citizen to militia to professional army something which has happened generally in societies across the world? And do you think it's possible to reverse that direction? Thank you.
Sorry, Jack, do you want to reply?
Okay, yeah, very good question, Ken. Again, I'm not a historian, but I know a little. I've mentioned ancient Rome, and ancient Rome definitely had a citizen militia and won many battles. We all know about Hannibal. That was a citizen militia doing the fighting. We know that ancient Athens had a citizen militia. But yes, precisely, when you have a Roman Empire and you start to govern not only all of Italy, but you start to have territories way beyond, a citizen militia cannot afford to be away from the farm for a year campaigning. It's just impossible, because you don't plant the crops. So it doesn't work. So yeah, they go over to a professional army. And you could make the same argument in the United States, that they were fighting the native population and they had a small professional army. But once America embarks on, how should we put it, an outward imperial expansion, then you have the Marines, you have a strong navy. The same in Britain. I mean, you had a very weak army in Britain up to 1914. Strong navy, that's absolutely right. Can we go back? Well, in a Marxist sense of the dialectic, yes, because we're not obviously aiming to go back to the citizen army of ancient Rome, but we're aiming to go forward to the citizen army of the Socialist Republic, which provides the basis, actually, I would argue, to abolish all armies and war. That would be my hope, that would be my belief, that it's socialism, not calls for peace and, passing resolutions saying stop the fighting. It's actually socialism that's our guarantor to get rid of this filthy business once and for all.
Interesting, thank you. Tony, please.
Yeah, I mean,
Tony, could you change your camera so we can see you?
Yeah, the problem is my
I know.
blue tack doesn't allow it to slip down. Yeah, firstly, on the present situation, which is what Jack started off, I mean, I basically agree with the position. The question is not one of Ukrainian national self-determination. Quite clearly, the main issue is the attempt by the United States to achieve, well, really world hegemony. And that includes encircling Russia with NATO countries, NATO bases, and nuclear weapons which can be fired literally across the border. So in that sense, it is aggressive defense, as you said. That doesn't therefore mean we have any love for the Putin regime, which is a rotten reactionary regime of really mafia capitalism in a sense, which and Putin expresses that and is in what he says. Well, Ukraine isn't a nation, has no rights, and so on and so forth. But insofar as the people of Donbass and Lugansk don't wish to be part of Ukraine, they do obviously have a right to secede. I mean, I don't think there is any doubt about it. It's also worth bearing in mind, for historical reasons, Ukrainian nationalism has always been a very right-wing, if not fascist, phenomena. I mean, you had the position in the Second World War where Ukrainian nationalists, although they varied from collaborating with the Nazis to fighting the Nazis, but the Jews were always their enemies, regardless of whether they were fighting the Nazis or not. So they took part and perpetrated mass pogroms and killings and so on and so forth. So on that, there's an agreement. The question of a citizens' army, I think, is more problematic in an era which is not a revolutionary era, because like in the United States, I mean, I speak to friends, particular black friends, who are opposed to this right to bear arms, because the only people who are doing it are the white militias, and they're bearing arms to attack the left, not the right, or not the state. And that does pose, I think, a very severe problem. And in practice in the United States, the right-wing militias are tolerated by the state. Indeed, the state works with them, as we saw last summer. But any attempt, for instance, at black self-defense is met with extreme repression. The state doesn't accept the right to bear arms for certain sections of the population. And that's why simply saying we support the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment is extremely problematic, because you can't divorce it from the political circumstances in which you find yourself. I'm not sure about Switzerland. I mean, I think Switzerland is fairly exceptional, but it's not a revolutionary situation, because Switzerland, until relatively recently, didn't have votes for women in some of the cantons, for example. So I doubt if women were included in the militia. It was also, of course, not invaded by by Nazi Germany. That was more to do with its financial acumen and position in the world, rather than the fact that it had a citizen army, or even because it had mountains. But that's by the by, because it certainly did attack other mountainous countries like Albania and so on. I think the question is how we raise the demand. I think in these the situation we're in, even if we raise it, it will have no political purchase. It will have no resonance, because we are in pretty backward times. I think it would have been useful, if not to raise a citizen army, certainly to raise the right to self-defense during the miners' strike, for instance, where you saw attacks on whole communities. I mean, I was in the village of Armthorpe in South Yorkshire, where people said the police had actually laid siege to the village before running riot. And we saw, of course, Orgreave, where unarmed miners in their jeans and trainers, as it were, went into battle against heavily armed policemen. So the demand should have been raised about minor self-defense during that strike. I'm not saying arm the right to bear guns, because I think it would have been a problem simply getting hold of the guns. But certainly in terms of basic self-defense against heavily armed police with riot shields, batons, dogs, and you name whatever. But yes, I mean, we should be raising the demand that, to delegitimize the existing army. And the problem is, of course, nationalism and in Britain's imperialist role. I mean, that's what the army serves to fulfill. It's not an army of defence. Britain isn't under attack. The army is there if you like, as a part of the role that British capitalism, plays in the world. So it's a demand that certainly we should talk about, but I don't think it's one that would form part of any programme today that has any popular purchase in terms of being received by the working class, for example. Because at the moment, of course, where guns are available, it's for people to actually rob each other rather than attack the state. So we do have a problem with it, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jack, would you like to reply to a few things?
Yeah, I mean, Tony and me agree on a lot of things and disagree about a few things, I think. And I mean, all I'd say on Ukrainian nationalism is that Ukrainian nationalism, I think we need to have a certain sympathy even to the far right on one level, in the same way that if you look at some nationalists in Egypt under the British Empire, or some nationalists in the Raj, in the Indian Empire, you know, look to the Japanese or look to the Nazis. They're looking to these people because, well, they must be better than the British. Delusional, I agree. Nonetheless, you know, you can see, you know, how their minds are working, and not least after the horrors of collectivization, you know, in the early 30s. Okay, so what we've got is, it's not a revolutionary situation. Well, yeah, I sort of know that, Tony, but the point would be that do you wait for a revolutionary situation to say no to Trident? Well, I wouldn't. You know, would you vote if you had MPs for the defence budget that included Queen Elizabeth II aircraft carrier? I wouldn't. What's the alternative then? And I would simply say that, well, our job surely is to popularise the programme of socialism, not wait for the masses to come to socialism before us, and then the socialists turn around and say, oh, the masses want a popular militia, oh, we better take up that demand. Or wait till a revolutionary situation arises. If you wait till a revolutionary situation arises, you're dead. And I mean that seriously. So there's a revolutionary situation, and you only then start to advocate a popular militia. No, you're going to be taken out and shot or put in a concentration camp or disappeared or whatever. So I don't think it's a question of a revolutionary situation. The socialists in the 19th century didn't just raise that question in the German Revolution. They raised it in 1875, 1876, 1877, etc., etc. The Labour Party raised it in Britain in 1900, not because there was a revolutionary situation, because it was a standard part of the socialist programme. Okay, in Switzerland, my understanding is now that women are integrated into the you know, the People's Army, the popular militia. I agree that Switzerland's a backward country, but the point I would make is precisely they can have a situation where there's no standing army and there's no revolutionary situation. And what would we advise Swiss people to do if a party came along and said, oh, what we want is a fully professional army, and we want to get rid of this popular army? We'll surely oppose it. And to me, when we're in a situation where we've got a professional army, peculiar professional army, made up of people from public schools at one end, the top end, the officer elite, and then people recruited from the bottom end, economic recruits, from the often the most poor sections of the working class. Surely we want to replace that system. We want to replace this very dangerous institution to us and democracy. And we ought to be popularizing the idea. In terms of what you say about the miners, well, the miners did form hit squads. And we were certainly in contact with people in the hit squads, but perhaps the most famous example of workers' self-defense in Britain was the miners' strike, in particular up in Scotland, Methil Fife, of where the police attacked the miners' pickets. And the workers responded by organising a 400-strong workers' defence corps, led by a guy on a white horse with a World War I helmet on. And of course, they were marching in military formation because they'd all been in the trenches. And what you know from that incident is that the police in Methil Fife never again attacked a picket line. And so I agree with the sentiment that you're putting forward, Tony. What you had is miners with their fists and with rocks, dressed in T-shirts in the miners' strike, with the police with shields, with batons, with helmets, using the tactics of Northern Ireland on the miners. And that was an unequal contest. And our job, surely, even in an industrial dispute, is to equalize, the force. We want force on our side. And we've got a great advantage, is there's a lot more of us than there are of the police and of the army. So, I don't think we should, I'll finish with it. I don't think that our job is to wait for a revolutionary situation to raise this question. How you raise it, that's a different question. You can raise it in an intelligent way or a stupid way, I agree, but we ought surely to raise it. And I really do praise the Labour Left Alliance for doing that. And I do remember that the Labour Left Alliance also, I think, at least deserves a good round of applause for actually taking the question of trade union rights in today's army seriously. To me, that's a splendid stance to have taken.
Cheers. Thanks, Jack. Matthew.
Yeah, I think, obviously not to go back over it. I think Tony, I agree with a lot of what Tony said about Ukraine, but I think the most important thing for us really is to say we need an anti-war movement, a proper one, to say we will not get involved in this. We don't want our ruling class to get involved in this stuff, and we demand actually that we have Britain out of the predatory alliance NATO. I think that's the main question at the moment for us, to say, okay, oppose your own ruling class above first, and I think, I think it's right that there should also be a debate about what's actually going on and there's political significance and so on, and I think that's, a great accommodation. Well, the other thing I think that in what Jack has is that there are issues here in terms of technique and of technology. I mean, the problem is, of course, what you're principally talking about in those terms, if you're looking at the Red Army, and there's a lot of stuff written on the Red Army, obviously, in terms of the experience and so on, and the sort of, obviously, Trotsky writing against, mad notions like, the proletarians never retreat and all this sort of stuff, and that, the whole issue, I mean, obviously books written about the lessons of the Red Army. But of course, the thing is, the thing, of course, is that in terms of the Red Army, of course, this is pre-air forces. I mean, it's before the advent of air power, and actually, what the US has done and other powers. I mean, this is what obviously devised by Winston Churchill in the 1920s, is to say, well, okay, bomber aircraft are cheap. We can just run those back and forward and just drop bombs on people, which is, of course, what he principally invented with the Kurds. Of course, the Kurds, of course, remember the fact the British were very, very fond of running bombing raids on them because, of course, they drew the parallels with what Saddam did to them, 60 years later. The problem being, of course, is that actually, in order to defend against an air force of modern air force, you actually need, some pretty sophisticated modern equipment and technicians and so on to keep it going. Because actually, if you look at the doctrine, I mean, is, of course, first of all, in case is to reduce anti-aircraft facility, and then they can basically bomb who they like. You know, once they've removed all that, and then of course the Americans, of course, their thing is to say, well, we'll basically flatten it. If it stands up more than 2 blocks high, you know, we'll flatten it, as you've seen in places like Mosul and you know, other parts. And you've seen in Afghanistan, of course, is the whole business. I mean, obviously the first thing is to run drones, in which case you just run around with a load of drones and basically shoot anything that moves. You know, which is what they've done effectively. Anything they don't like, they you know, that they can see with a video camera from a height of whatever, and they just drop missiles on it. You know, and that's the problem you've got, is actually that you need to stop that from happening for a start. So you actually need to use technique. The other thing, of course, is that the other experience, of course, the other issue with the Red Army, of course, is that there was no naval question. Russia's never really been a naval power, so they didn't have to bother. I mean, effectively, the Navy actually was one of the great progenitors of the Bolshevik Party. Of course, the Bolsheviks actually, the lower officers and some of the sailors, of course, were great revolutionaries themselves, but of course they didn't actually then have to fight at sea, because actually, of course, most of what they did was to take part in revolutions. So, I mean, in those terms, it's one of technique, and this also, of course, then also rises in the whole question, you know, of these sort of guerrilla notions, and you can see that, you know, in terms of the question comes down, you know, in things like the Black Panthers. If you look at the Panthers, actually at certain points, and they're very specific, you can see the Panthers had to make a choice. Were they a mass organization, in which case they'd organize, which they could have done. They could have organized, you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of people very easily, because, I mean, obviously they had that sort of following, you know, at certain points. Or were they some kind of small guerrilla army? And they decided to be a small guerrilla army, which then, of course, basically left them open to these positions where basically the cops either were using huge amounts of force against them, or they just turned up and killed them. You know, I mean, you've got things like all-day sieges and all this sort of stuff, and these cops would fire thousands and thousands of rounds and basically demolish buildings, you know, in order to attack the Panthers. You know, and that also, of course, became the issue for something like the IRA. I mean, there was a point, you know, the thing is, of course, obviously, originally at the start in the late 60s, of course, there was this fairly popular uprising, but very soon it became a question: are you actually running a popular uprising or a guerrilla operation? And the IRA decides the guerrilla operation, which is all running among a very small number of people, you know, and so on, and everything becomes fairly isolated and all this sort of thing. And the question for us really is to say, well, actually, we're in favour of a popular organisation and the building of a revolutionary party, which is completely different. You know, and I think the final point, I mean, I agree. I mean, for me, I think the important thing is actually to raise this stuff politically. I mean, as the SPD did, of course, in its parliamentary fraction up till 1914, and say, well, we will not vote for this stuff. We will not, you know, not a man, not a penny for the defence budget. You know, we won't vote for it. You know, it's not ours. And this is quite correct. And this is the issue, is to say, well, you know, we need a resurrection of this under the conditions in which, you know, we say even quite clearly the lessons of Marx's lessons of the commune, of course, is to say, well, it's not our state, it's their state. And we will not, you know, it exists in order to keep them in power. And our job is to demolish it. And we will not cooperate with it. You know, and obviously we have to be a bit clever in terms of the slogans raised and how you actually sort of, you know, pull people towards you and all this sort of stuff. But we have to have that basic understanding, and I think that is correct.
Thank you, Matt. I should say it was only Karl Liebknecht left at the end, wasn't he, opposing war credits? The rest of them collapsed. Kevin, please, as next. You need to unmute yourself, Kevin. It's very modern.
There we
Got
are.
it now.
Good. So, thanks, Jack, for the introduction and some good historical points there. The thing when you're around about 9th or 10th in the queue is that everybody else has come in and made the points that you wanted to make. So I would agree with the bulk of what other comrades have said, but I think there's there are a couple of points which I think are interesting. I think Ken raised a very interesting point about the history of professional armies. And indeed, even in the Roman example, when the army became more professionalized and permanent, when, for example, it became linked with plunder and with conquest, then it bolsters a particular power structure. And indeed, in the case of Caesar and the various military dictators that come after it, you actually then get the empire itself emerging. So the army is, the professional army is in essence a repressive organization. There's never been a sort of good professional army, and that, I suppose, is what motivates in large numbers of countries, and Jack referred to it. It motivates suspicion of the army. So, for example, in England and then in Britain, the Army Act was originally something that had to be voted annually to get the approval of the House of Commons and of Parliament, even for the existence of the army, because an army was always seen as a potentially repressive body against the liberties of the subject, to use the legal language of the time, and perhaps more importantly, to be the basis of some sort of coup. So there's a tremendous suspicion of armies. And what I think we have to do when we're campaigning around this question is to sort of return to that suspicion and ask what the role of the army is. It's clearly a repressive organization. It's not, I think, just important to see it as a repressive organization when it goes into an imperialist war or it intervenes in another state, something like that. It's also historically been more often used against its own population. You know, there's a long, discreditable history of the use of troops against the populations of Europe. In Germany, for example, or technically in Alsace-Lorraine, but in Germany in 1913, before the First World War, the so-called Saarbrücken incident showed the repressive nature of that army. The use of troops against strikes in Britain again shows that. So that for us, I think, has to be the important point. Also, in raising this issue of the nature of the army, we're, I think, really talking about the role and the nature of the state itself. So it isn't, I think, just a purely democratic demand, even though it was part of the armory of radical Democrats, and indeed even some liberal politicians in Britain in the 19th century were quite hostile to the army. It was the Tory imperialists, and indeed the so-called little Englanders, the liberal politicians who were in favour were not so keen on imperial expansion, were also ones who were always arguing against military expenditure. And it's, so there is, I think, a long tradition which has now been largely forgotten, been deliberately forgotten, and one we need to return to. On some of Matthew's points of technology, I mean, I think there are some points about the nature of air warfare and the use of aircraft. The last time that air warfare extensively against civilian populations, we can debate how far it was used.
Kevin, your internet is getting very unstable. Do you want to finish it with your camera off, maybe? Because we can hardly, you're getting very wobbly. And now you're frozen. You're looking very puzzled.
Is that okay?
Yes, I think that's better. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm just recovering from a bit of flu, so it may be that as well.
I doubt it. It doesn't affect your internet, I don't think.
Yeah. So the point about the use of air power was something that imperialists did consider, from the 20s. That there was a degree of air power used against the Russian Revolution. So I wouldn't entirely rule that out. But obviously, in comparison with the modern era of drones and of massive air power, it's clear, though, that if a state wants to control territory, I don't think that it can do that solely by air power. You know, comrades may remember that in the 20s and 30s, even in the level of science fiction, there was a belief that air power could be a way of controlling the world. You may remember the H.G. Wells novel, The Shape of Things to Come, which has a sort of global elite of an air force flying around the world solving problems or killing people, depending on how you want to look at it. But the question of controlling territory, I think, still rests primarily in armed force. And I think that, again, in raising this demand, we're raising democratic demands. And we're also raising demands about our conceptions of socialism and democracy that do involve, you know, mass popular participation, mass working class population. And so in striking at it in this way, I think we do that. Jack's also correct about the LLA's position on trade union rights. And one of the reasons why I'm aware of that is that I think the original motion that was put to our conference was from Liverpool, Merseyside LLA, and it was actually moved by a former soldier. And I think the point he was making was that conditions in the existing army, the relationship between the ranks, the dictatorial attitudes, the poor conditions and so on, that trade union rights would be again a way of disaffecting, of mobilizing and of undermining the power of the status quo in the army. And I think again, it's a perfectly acceptable campaigning demand, but one that's very unlikely to be taken up by many people on the left. Just lastly on Ukraine, I think the comrades have been quite right in how they've expressed this. I think the arguments though that we're going to be faced with in the labour movement are the way that we should stand in support of the democratic rights of Ukraine. We should stand in support of a country that's being attacked. And that means for some comrades in the movement, giving a degree of critical support, indeed not just critical support, really quite enthusiastic support to NATO, to the European Union, to the United States and so on. And I think the danger of doing that is the same danger that Lenin in the First World War pointed to, which was that everybody has their own democratic sort of spin on the war. So for the Germans, it was defense against French and Russian aggression and for the liberation of Poland. For the British, it was plucky little Belgium and gallant Serbia and so on. And the point about raising demands in this way and posing it in this way is that you are lining up with your own ruling class. There are always plenty of opportunities for the ruling class to use those sorts of demands. So when comrades talk about the real enemy is at home, when they use that sort of demand, they're pointing out the class nature of the war. And above all, they're talking about the politics behind the war and not just being sucked into a sort of simple binary. It's the sort of voice that comrades have referred to, the voices not only of Lenin, but of Karl Liebknecht and his father as well, Wilhelm. The sort of voices that stand out against militarism and warmongering. And those voices were really very absent in the parliamentary debate. If one Labour MP could have used the debate to raise these questions, then it would have been electrifying. And just to sort of give an example, although I have many disagreements with him, but just think of the way that George Galloway used his appearance in America before the Senate committee, the way he used that platform to expose the nature of the American role in Iraq. And if one Labour MP had done that in the House of Commons yesterday, it would have raised the level and the nature of this war to a new level. Anyway, thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Kevin. Instead, we just heard the news that all 11 MPs who signed a Stop the War Coalition statement have just withdrawn their names after Starmer told them they would lose the whip. Apparently it took less than 1 hour. Less than 1 hour. There's no Karl Liebknecht in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but we kind of knew that. Jack, did you want to reply to anything that Kevin was saying? We have a couple more people who want to.
Well, just Matthew raised some very interesting, I think, important points. I mean, all I'd say, Matthew, is first of all, okay, peace. When ordinary people call for peace, I have great sympathy for them. But when we actually get socialists saying it's peace is the key question, then I have to disagree. Surely what we need is not a peace movement, we need a socialist movement. And of course, we can build a socialist movement on ordinary people's sentiment, wish for peace. In terms of aircraft and high technology, I agree with you. Of course, it's a problem, but I don't think it's an insurmountable problem. I mean, all I would say this is that if you look at American imperialism, it suffered 2 big defeats in its history. You know, one was Vietnam. And I know that North Vietnam had a few aircraft, but I've traveled in Vietnam, and what you notice is that the whole of the countryside is covered in pockmarks from B-52 bombs. Who won? Who won? You know, a peasant army or America with its B-52s. It was America that had to scuttle out of Saigon. And then we've just seen Afghanistan with the Taliban. Okay, they had some Stinger missiles, no doubt supplied courtesy of America. But America had drones, America had aircraft, America had tanks and armored cars, and it lost. And so I agree with you that we can't just say, oh, it's not a problem. But I don't think that we want to fetishize it and say that this stops any potential for us to be successful. And the other thing I was going to add on that is that because we're a mass movement, or aspire to become a mass movement, we can win supporters from all quarters. And that not only includes the rank and file of the army, it includes people at the top of the security service, top of the army, top of the police force. I mean, I just mentioned this, that in 1917, the head of the Finnish police was pro-Bolshevik and informed Lenin precisely, oh, by the way, they just issued orders to arrest you, hence his scuttling out of Petrograd into Finland. So technical questions are important, but I don't think at the end of the day that they are decisive. And in terms of what Kevin was saying, yeah, I mean, all I would say is that, again, in terms of H.G. Wells, his sort of science fiction that air power would solve everything just hasn't been proved. It's been the opposite, hasn't it? Since then, that people will resist, even if they don't have aircraft, they will resist. And just lastly, in terms of what Tina just said to us in terms of the news, I agree with you, Tina. I didn't know that 11 had signed it, but the fact that they collapsed so easily shows you that they put their careers in front of principle. But I would mention this, that Karl Liebknecht, and we're quite right to praise him and single him out, he actually voted with the majority first time round. So in the first parliamentary vote, he put up his hand as an act of discipline. So we should condemn these people, these 11, but we should still call upon them next time to rebel or sign up. Either way, the point would be that Karl Liebknecht was steadily joined by others. But the key question to me, as I said before, is not a peace movement, not a call for peace from Stop the War Coalition. It's a socialist movement that's the key. And that's what we need to keep our eyes on.
Yep, thanks. Harry, please.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. You know,
whether this question, whether we should have a citizens' army or perhaps a standing army, I mean, I don't think there's a yes or a no answer to this. If you look what happened in Ireland, 1913, during the Dublin lockout, the employers through the police force carried out repression of the strikers on the street. It led to the first Bloody Sunday here. Connolly's reaction, James Connolly, reacted by setting up the Irish Citizens' Army that was based on the Transport and General Workers' Union. Now that clearly, it wasn't the biggest army in the world, it was about 300 people, but he set it up quite clearly to defend the workers in Dublin. 3 years later, Connolly used that same army to link up with the Irish Republican Brotherhood and moved, in other words, it moved from a defensive army into an offensive army and was used in the 16 uprising. Now, we know the results of the 16 uprising, but was he right or was he wrong? And the fact is, in Ireland in 1916 was a pre-revolutionary situation, just in many ways a bit like in Russia pre-1917. He used it to overthrow, to take control and to drive British imperialism out of the country. He went on the offensive. Lenin's remarks at that time was, in the 16 Rising, he said the 16 Rising, he said the mistake of the Irish was not that they arose, but that they arose prematurely. In other words, the timing, and there was organizational problems. But in other words, they were absolutely correct, certainly in Lenin's eyes, that you needed to be armed in a pre-revolutionary situation. And we have examples and examples and examples. Tiananmen Square, China, what was the mistake? It was about student uprising, but the workers were behind it. They were not armed. In order, not only for a defensive matter, but to be used in an offensive manner in a revolutionary situation. Now, okay, those are circumstances, particular circumstances. We wouldn't be talking about building a citizens' army now, not in the situation we're in. Let's go a bit more closer to today. If you or I were living in Russia or China at the present time, China, South China Sea, surrounded with a massive military United States naval buildup, would you feel under threat? Or in Russia, as we now see in the current circumstances, the expansion of NATO over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO right up to its borders, would they progress any further? Well, they may well do. Would you feel under threat? I would say you would, and we would. And it would be absolutely understandable that these countries would build a defensive standing army, perhaps with all the defensive military technology that is available to defend that country against attack. And I'm sure that it's very evident in the minds, particularly in the people of Russia, what happened 70 years ago during the Second World War, where Stalin, by the way, was completely caught out. He wasn't prepared for the invasion of Nazi Germany, and they had to make up a lot of lost time and nearly lost the country because he did not have a military build-up, standing army with military defense in order to defend the country. He was very lucky at the end of the day. But you take the situation from Russia and China and compare that with America, the biggest empire in human history, with an expenditure way out any other country. Does it need a standing army? Where's in America? Is there a threat to the American people right now? Well, if it is, where's it coming from? Is the threat from Russia? Is it from China? Is it apart from Middle Eastern groups, the ISIS, and so on? There isn't one. And we would, at the moment, does America need a standing army and a massive military machine? I don't think it does. and you would call for that country to be completely demilitarized and the standing army exactly to stand down. There isn't a need for one. And Britain, I think, is the same likewise. There isn't a need for one. That's not to say that there wouldn't be a time when you would need for one. America uses its army for offense to expand the American empire. And it is the biggest cause of the destabilization in world relations at the present time. So I don't think any armies should be brought under democratic control if and when it is needed. And we live in a world of high tech, and there was a battle between high tech. Unfortunately, between the East and the West, it is superiority. It's not for defense. It is to dominate the other in one way or another. There's cyber, all of these things about. So all I'm just saying is, I don't think there's a yes or a no answer to this. There's a time when we would arm the working class, even in a defensive manner, to defend ourselves and perhaps even go on the offense. And I think there's a time when we would need a standing army that needs to be brought under democratic control, to be set up to defend ourselves, not to go on the offensive, but defend ourselves. So I think it's a very open question. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Harry. Jack, do you want to reply?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to draw a opposite from defense and offense. You know, any general that told me, well, I only do defensive wars, deserves the sack. Ditto, I only do offensive wars. I mean, war by its definition involves shifts. You can be defeated, you advance, and the same in revolution. Harry quoted precisely, and I think correctly, Connolly, in Dublin, defending the workers, and then in 1916 using the same force to go on the offensive. Well, exactly. So in 1917 in Russia, you had the Red Guard, and you also had pro-Bolshevik regiments that were used to topple the provisional government. I agree. So I wouldn't myself draw a distinct line between offense and defense. Also, in terms of, again, I don't want to get myself into the position of what would you do if you were. I'm not Putin. I'm not Xi. I'm not the head of the Chinese state. I'm not head of the Russian state. I'm not likely to become head of the Russian state. And I don't view these governments as anti-imperialist or pro-socialist. In the same way, you know, you can make the argument, well, wasn't it right for Germany to attack first in 1914 because it was being surrounded, and France, Russia, and Britain were preparing for war to crush it? Well, I sort of understand it, but I'm not going to take Germany's side in that. And so I'm not going to get myself into a position of saying, I understand why China's doing what it's doing. I do. I understand why Russia's doing what it's doing, but I also understand why the United States is doing what it's doing as well. It's an imperial power in decline, and it's pushing back because there are rivals to it. And just lastly, the approach I would take, Harry, is much more that of appealing to the troops on the other side, rather than threatening, the population of London, for example, if I happen to be in Moscow and head of the government, with nuclear annihilation. No, I'd be appealing to ordinary citizens to overthrow their government. And I think that's the approach that we need to take. So I agree with you that there's a lot of high technology about, but ultimately what we've got is people operating that technology, and we can appeal to these people and we can win these people. So yeah, technology is very powerful, but still at the present time, the idea of socialism, I think, is far more powerful than that. So my own view is that, yeah, I did argue that the Soviets were forced to adopt a standing army. So I agree with you to that extent, that we should never say never, 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 never. But I think as a general approach, because we don't want to conquer foreign lands, as a general approach, we should be advocating the citizens' army, and we should be standing for the abolition of the professional army in the same way that Trotsky did as head of that Red Army, in the early 1920s, even though he was turned down. Whether that decision was right or wrong, I'll leave aside.
Thank you. Anne, please, next.
Hi, thanks, comrades. And I echo the comments made by Jack of the importance of having this debate, and congratulate comrades in the LLA for taking the initiative. So firstly, on the question of the right to bear arms, I think that, as others have said, that it's a political question. And I would say that it's at no time more important actually than in a situation where our rulers are unleashing weapons at each other and actually killing the working class, killing the masses. So like people I know I've spoken to are very afraid about this war. And I mean, I live in Ireland, so we're very unlikely to suffer ourselves. But people in the Ukraine, people, including Russians in the Ukraine, who Putin has said that he's going into rescue, perhaps not in the Donbass region, because I would think they may be afraid to go out and protest there. And in Russia, there's been protests today, which I've seen some shots of. They seem like they're not organized protests in the sense that I didn't see any banners or anything, but the police and the military are already, on top of these protests. And given the nature of the Russian state, I think that it's a very dangerous time for people to go out in the streets and protest in Russia, but protest they will. The problem is, like in Russia, as in other parts of the world where people do come out and protest against their own regime, if they haven't got the idea of arming themselves, then they are far too easily crushed. I mean, somebody mentioned Tiananmen Square earlier. Well, look at that. I mean, the students believed that it wasn't going to happen. They didn't think that the state was going to roll the tanks in over them. And they, basically you could say that their tactics were extremely naive. And then they were crushed and killed. So I think that, like, if we don't think about this question now, if we don't raise this question now, particularly in these circumstances, then I think that it's very remiss of us as Marxists. In relation to Russia, I've already mentioned that I've seen protests. In terms of the situation in the Donbass region, I'm a lot more circumspect about this question of self-determination. I'm not denying that there is a Russian population in that region, but I know for certain that Putin has been manipulating whatever connections he has, and also been funding organizations, perhaps armed organizations there. There's been killings of one particular journalist in Russia who exposed the fact that there was money going to the Donbass region from Putin's government in order to fund some of these forces. And people in Russia, I think, are well aware of the corruption within their state. And I would say myself that perhaps, I mean, I know Navalny is clearly no answer, but people, the fact that he's raised this corruption is something that's, it's true for the people living there. In terms of the NATO then, and the announcement from Europe of these sanctions, clearly the people of Russia are the ones that are going to suffer, and they're already suffering. They're living in an economy which is, really at a low level. The majority of people find it hard to struggle on a day-to-day basis already. Now they're going to be faced with even more pressure. And I think, we need to call for solidarity with the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine, but we should call for defeat for both sides, and for the working class to take the advantage of the current situation. Obviously, the working class is weak, And that's unfortunate, very unfortunate, but nevertheless, I think the political call should be made. Just a final point. You see, I think, and I've said this before at other meetings, is that, and it's actually, I've read it in the media today, that there's a parallel between Putin's approach to Georgia in going in and recognizing Abkhazia and Ossetia, but in doing it on this occasion and with the Donbass, obviously he's acted in a far more violent manner, in a far more aggressive manner. And like, it's a tactic he's used in order to retain control over the countries around Russia. But I don't know. But I mean, he's full of threats, and obviously NATO will respond. And you know, it's just, well, I don't know. I think that Putin thinks he can manage the situation, but I doubt that he actually can. And like, lastly, I saw there was a street protest in Ireland today outside the Dáil, and Richard Boyd Barrett, who's People for Profit Alliance and who is a TD, he was making a call, which is, I'd say, similar to the Stop the War Coalition call for an end to all wars, which obviously isn't going to put the working class in a position to really take on and defeat this system. But nevertheless, I think it's better to have him there doing that along with his comrades than in a situation where, as in Britain, unfortunately, the Labour Party MPs have decided to withdraw their signatures and to come in behind their leader. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Before Jack replies, I'm just going to quickly do a screen share to show comrades if they haven't seen it yet. That's the only demo that's being planned at the moment, as far as I know, is from the awful Ukraine Solidarity campaign, which is run by the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. Russia, hands off Ukraine, troops out now for a free, united Ukraine. Doesn't mention NATO, obviously totally ignores the issue of self-determination, etc. It's the Stop the War Coalition has put out quite good statements, but it's a shame they're not doing anything more at the moment. Perhaps that's still coming. Jack, did you want to reply to Anne, or should we bring in the next?
Yeah, I think it's just worthwhile. I mean, what I would say, Anne, I mean, again, I don't know, but it would really surprise me very much if you look at the present regime in Kiev, with its the laws that it passed, depriving the Russians of equal status in terms of language, let alone the shady characters that it promoted, and all the rest of it. I would be amazed if there wasn't a genuine Russian question, not least in the East. It's like looking at World War I and saying there was no Danish question, no Irish question, no question of Alsace-Lorraine, and no Polish question. These questions are real to me. So the fact that, Putin is sending in money, well, that's what they do. It's a bit like saying, well, I was really surprised that Germany wanted to support Irish nationalists in World War I. Well, you'd be amazed if they weren't trying to do that, or the Japanese weren't trying to support Indian nationalists in World War II. So this isn't a creation of the Kremlin. That's really what I'm trying to argue. Of course, the Kremlin's got its fingers there, but in the same way, anyone who thinks that the CIA hasn't had its fingers in Kiev and manipulating events there would just be naive. Of course they have been doing it. I wouldn't put that down to say, oh, it's just the CIA. I mean, that's all I'm trying to say. In terms of what you were saying, in terms of, end all wars, well, it's just a pacifist slogan. And I agree with you. I prefer pacifists to the social imperialists of the Ukraine Solidarity campaign. But let's not go for lesser of evils. Social pacifism is trying to fool people that you can have peace under capitalism. that, you know, that you can have a withdrawal and everyone lives, you know, happily. That's just a lie. And socialists ought to know that. Ordinary people who say that, of course, I have huge sympathy for. And, you know, we rely on these people and their sentiments in order to go forward. But we want them to go forward and stop the war coalition. And your comrade, not your comrades, your friends in Ireland are actually kidding people. And I think we need to be honest with that. So, yes, I prefer them to the AWL and John McDonnell and Paul Mason. Yes, but they are no different in that sense to, you know, I mean, if I use the word now, Karl Kautsky, Kautskyism, social pacifism, that's actually what they're preaching. And I think we need to criticize them, yeah, as well as, of course, the social imperialists, who are NATO socialists.
Yep. Mark, please.
Yeah. Good evening. Point I wanted to raise is just how few people in this country actually are aware of the fact that the army here has been used against its own citizens. I just described in briefly the town I live in, Halifax now, where most people, even in the town, are totally unaware that in the August of 1842, the largest political event which took place in this town was ruthlessly suppressed, with many people being killed. There isn't anything up in the town to commemorate those that were killed. There will be a plaque going up on August the 13th this year, and people would be welcome to come along. There'll be some music and there'll be some other events taking place. Even the raising of the plaque has proved something of an embarrassment to people now who are involved in the politics of the Labour Party in particular. And to raise that in the context of what the British Army have done in other places in Blackburn and Preston at that particular period is seen as very much a no-no in large sections of the Labour movement. 1842 was, of course, in general, the biggest mass movement that Britain has ever seen in terms of England, Scotland in particular, with over 1 million people taking generalised strike action in demands of an extended democratic vote. And of course, the fact that people were starving and needed better pay terms and conditions. What I'd like to see is, I can see why Dave Nellis might err on the side of caution for obvious reasons, because anything which comes about to challenge in any shape, form or fashion the standing army is a very serious offence. You can't, of course, leaflet the army, and you would find yourself under some severe pressure if you did do so. What I do think, however, is that many in the army, and I do know a lot of people who've been in the army, a great many, to be fair, from all ranks of the army, is that many of them are familiar and are particularly knowledgeable about the role that they are fulfilling. And that's particularly the case when they leave the army. They know that they're basically, I think there's a Republican slogan, isn't it, saying something like Parliament is the political wing of the British Army. And I think many people do know that, they do understand it. So the development of a popular militia clearly would be necessary in part to be built on people who have that expertise. And I think that in part is possible. It's difficult at the moment to put forward a slogan, however, to replace it with a popular militia or a citizens' army, because I do think anybody who had any real success in putting this forward would find themselves being arrested. I do think they would get sent to prison, and that is a distinct possibility. And the other thing is, what I would like to see is that historically, and I've been on many places where people have physically engaged in, I'm not saying armed struggle, but in some fairly violent events and activities. I've been on many picket lines, Easton and Colliery at the end of August in 1984, where I was a convener in a factory at the time, and but many of my friends worked at the colliery, and it was interesting at the beginning of the week when they brought up originally the coppers from Northants, and then they were at South Wales, and then they brought the Met up. At the beginning of the week, many of us who'd, there was politicals like myself, but there was also many lads of my generation who went to away games with Sunderland. And in the 80s, you went to away games. There were three gangs who went generally. There was the away fans, the home fans, but the best organised bunch of hooligans was the police. And they enjoyed, without doubt, the fights with away fans. So we were seeing the cops weren't to be trusted, whereas the older miners in particular, and those who hadn't actually been picketing, like some of us, went to Orgreave and other places like that, we were saying you need to be very careful. But anyway, by the Tuesday, after they handed out a few heavy blows, people were very much on track with, we need to defend ourselves, we need to be better organised, we need to understand that, we need to do that. And okay, on the Friday, when they took the scab in through the back door, and they took him in through the back door because despite the huge numbers of police that had turned up, they couldn't actually get him in through the front door. People rioted, turned over the niggards, people's cars, set fire to them, and engaged in a serious battle with the police, such that they took him in through the back door. They then absolutely demolished us. There's no question about that. They beat people extremely badly. We all got chased. There's no question about that. And it was a real difficult problem and difficult engagement. But nevertheless, historically, and obviously I lived in Hackney for a long time, and I organised immigrant workers. And we always, funny enough, I just picked up the notes of the 3rd of August, 1991, which was the biggest, largest, perhaps, strike action ever by immigrant workers. That was in support of the Turkish general strike on that particular day. And, when I say me, there was 7 Turkish and Kurdish groups, myself from the Trade Union Support Unit, Hackney Community Defence Association. We got together the day before. We planned how we would monitor the event. We planned the stewards. We did all of that. What we failed to do was that the strike was successful. What we failed to do is to understand that police would perhaps come back later in the day, and which is what they did. And 65 people were arrested. On a personal level, at least 15 of those were arrested, defending myself, as there was an attempt to arrest myself as one of the organisers. The other thing is, what I would say is that there have been, isn't just in black communities where there have been that defensive organisations. I would contend that anti-fascist action and sections of Red Action themselves had moved in the late 80s and the early 90s into ideas of defence, and that they provided, and that we provided, stewards on many events in areas where it would have been difficult for people to hold meetings. That's not putting forward people as a things, but they had moved beyond that system of like defence into also a degree of attack. Although we certainly never ever went out of our way to attack the police. That would have been suicidal. We would have got well done over. I mean, AFRA and the Red Action and other people involved, the Diamond stuff, helped, for example, organise some of the students, even at the Pride marches, which were coming under attack from the police and were coming under attack from the far right as well. So it's not all doom and gloom by any means. People do learn very quickly. They have an understanding, and that process is very quickly. And we do have in our communities people who I think do have some understanding of those sorts of things. As a complete aside, I'd end with this. A good friend of mine, he's a former paratrooper, would never speak out and say these sorts of things, but in his head, he knows that that is the reality of the subject. He later became a convener, was a convener for 20 years at work, and he has an understanding, but he wouldn't speak out at this particular stage. The ruling class know that many people are not entirely always on their side. They look one way, but they could face the other, which is why ultimately the state always seeks to spy on people, always seeks to place people in our organizations, because it fears the actual reality, the dynamics of capitalism. Okay, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mark. I think just before Jack sums up, his speech reminded me of a comrade I knew when I was living in Germany, still in the Linke Party, who was actually a spy from East Germany, who was sent into the German army, German Bundeswehr, to fight for trade union demands, etc. I mean, to get more democracy for the soldiers, to split the army and create rebellion in the ranks, which he thought was, the East German state and probably the Soviet Union thought was very important, and quite right too. Jack, so I hope you can sum up in your final words, maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
I'll be very brief. I thought actually what Mark was saying was very useful, and I'll really just end by replying to what he was saying. I mean, yeah, in terms of history, 1842, the Chartists, that deserves to be remembered, and not least the physical force wing of the Chartist movement. Just from if we're talking about anecdotes, just from my own family history, my grandfather was a professional sailor, and they were deployed in South Wales during the general strike of 1926. And it's one of these family stories that they actually all refused to pick up rifles, and no discipline followed. They were simply marched back on to the ships. So this is precisely the danger that the ruling class and the high command know, that when it comes to domestic struggles, troops are much less reliable. When it comes to their brothers, their sisters, people they know, the same language that they speak. And it's also why in the miners' strike, as Mark was saying, why they deployed, Met Police up in Yorkshire, for example. They weren't going to be coming across people that they knew. And within that, it shows you the vulnerability of these institutions. But I actually think, Mark, you were wrong when it comes to raising this question and it being so dangerous, and you automatically end up in prison. Well, the Labour Party didn't in 1900. And I'll just tell you this, it's far from a revolutionary party. The Green Party, under the leadership of Natalie Bennett, actually stood on a manifesto to abolish the standing army and to adopt a citizen army. She didn't end up in prison. Dave Nellis would not end up in prison. And this precisely, to me, shows you socialists making an excuse to abandon socialism. It's like, the 11 MPs. Well, they threatened to withdraw the whip from us. Therefore, we had to, abandon our social pacifist principles and go with Sakir, a NATO warmonger. Well, no, sorry. What we need to be demanding of these leaders, if you believe in socialism, if you believe that capitalism is the problem, stay true to your principles, and then the masses, right, will look upon you as a leader. If you just give in at the first push, what use are you? So I don't think it's a difficult demand in terms of one that would get you in prison, but it is a difficult demand precisely because the left isn't committed to socialism. It's committed to reform within capitalism. In essence, what we have in terms of these 11 MPs is people subordinating principle to their careers. Just in terms of former army people, again, I agree with Mark. I mean, you know, I came across former army people in the NUM in 84, 85. And what was interesting about them is that them having served in Northern Ireland, they saw the tactics that the police were using against the miners that they'd participated in using against civil rights marchers, against, you know, Republicans, against nationalists in the north of Ireland. And I'll finish with this, precisely the observation made by Karl Marx, that a nation that suppresses another nation can never be free. That's true with Britain, it's true with Russia. It's also true with the United States and its NATO project and its determination to hang on to global hegemony. The United States, NATO, they are not free nations. You know, none of us live in free nations.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us tonight. I think that was a very eye-opening and interesting session. We really have to go far beyond, you know, calls for peace and justice, etc., which is, yes, what the Stop the War Coalition effectively does. But even that is too much for the 11 MPs. I've just looked at the statement. It is really very harmless and very balanced, you know, actually starts with a critique of Russia. So it's pathetic, to put it mildly, that they can't even stick to these half principles that they have, pacifist principles that they have. So thank you very much, Jack. I think we could have clarified a few slogans in our history and why it's important to go beyond pacifism, etc. And I hope you all join us next week. We'll be looking at abolishing the patriarchy, which is really just a way to get Camilla Power and Chris Knight, two radical anthropologists, to talk about how society used to be run by women and could probably be run by women again, or at least in a more egalitarian way, and how people became humans, etc. It's a fascinating subject. I hope comrades will join us next week. Thank you very much, comrades. Yes, Tony, even you should come, particularly you should come to that session. Thanks, comrades. Have a good evening. Bye.